Welcome class, please come in. Take a seat and make yourself comfortable before you get out your notebooks. Today's class is RSR-104, a retrospective review of Liberation Maiden for the Nintendo 3DS. As always, please be aware this review contains heavy spoilers for the game, so please, if you do not want to be spoiled before you play it, pause the lesson here and go do so before going any further, as this class will be still available when you return. However, given the 3DS eShop's closure, that may be easier said than done if you do not already have Liberation Maiden purchased. Also, please note, today's lesson is significantly smaller in scope than our previous one, so all being well, you shouldn't require a bucket of popcorn this time around. Having said that, I should get started so as not to run the risk of cutting into your lunch break. Liberation Maiden is a single-player shoot-'em-up game developed by Grasshopper Manufacture, best known for zombie hack-'em-up Lollipop Chainsaw as well as the No More Heroes franchise, and published by Level 5, who are responsible for such classics as the Professor Layton and Yokai Watch series amongst others, and was released in October and November of 2012 exclusively for the Nintendo 3DS. Curiously, the game was originally released as part of a compilation called Guild 01, also for the 3DS, in the prior May, although in this case only in Japan, alongside 3 other games: the RPG Crimson Shroud, Airport Simulator Aeroporter, and rhythm game Weapon Shop Day Omasei. I think I said that one right, before getting its standalone digital release later that year. Whilst I cannot be sure if this was the intent, the selection of games it was originally released alongside, as well as the limited scope of each of them, does make it feel like a test of the 3DS's development cycle for the teams involved before they devoted themselves to bigger projects. The storyline of Liberation Maiden is sparse, to say the least, partially because of genre and partially because it only has a runtime of a little over an hour to fit everything in. The basic premise is that Japan has been invaded by an evil foreign dominion who wishes to expand its holdings and harvest the vast spiritual energy that suffuses the land. This invasion forces the people of Japan to flee their home, forming New Japan aboard a vast airship that is their safe haven, as air superiority of any sort is unknown to this dominion. The game itself then follows as the second president of this New Japan, a schoolgirl by the name of Shoko Azora, because who else could lead a nation at war in anime land, as she takes to the skies in her mech Kamui to reclaim and liberate Japan and restore the devastated ecosystem along the way by blasting everything related to the Dominion even remotely with a vast amount of lasers. Single-handedly, I should add as well, the Kamui seems to be New Japan's only actual military asset aside from the airship itself. The details of why most of these targets are important is never really explained, simply being mentioned as key to the liberation or an important target as far as flimsy excuses as to why Shoko is ripping through each area like a laser-based tsunami. The story climaxes in a battle at Mount Fuji with an enormous kaiju guardian spirit that has been corrupted by the experimentations of the invading Dominion, before ending on a cliffhanger as it is revealed in the final cutscene that despite being driven out on land and sea, the Dominion has finally developed aircraft of its own, where they apparently started with a literal flying fortress, revealing that the fight to liberate Japan is not yet over. This probably sounds somewhat like a bullet points of the story, but that is the entirety of what is presented during the span of the game's runtime itself, from a handful of conversations with Shoko's right-hand Kira. So congratulations if you intended to play the game for the story. I just spoiled literally everything for you. Sorry. I should add that there are some additional tidbits of lore locked away behind the game's achievement system, which do such things as slightly more detail the invasion of Japan, the state of the Dominion, or provide an insight into the manufacture of New Japan and the Kamui mech. These do not really add to or even enhance the story presented in the game, instead more acting as a background world building, as basically none of it is presented or even hinted at elsewhere, although even then don't expect anything earth-shattering. There are some interesting notes on how technology developed within this universe and the way it works, but the majority consists of rather banal details that lean into genre tropes. Curiously, details such as the population of New Japan or a concrete location for the Dominion are glossed over, although for the former I would imagine it must be considerable for such a small craft. The election process alone consists of 450 members, unless that is literally the entire population and everyone else is either dead or living under occupation, I guess. Overall, I would say the story is passable if sparse and trope heavy. It's just enough to set the scene for the game, but nothing more, and it would become boring incredibly fast if the game was any longer than it was. Similarly passable is Liberation Maiden's gameplay, which consists of a reasonably standard third-person shoot-'em-up experience, split over 4, technically 5 levels of increasing difficulty. Players control Kamui using the circle pad, with the mech moving with what I can best describe as airborne tank controls, with up and down moving the mech forwards and backwards whilst the left and right directions pivot the craft in air, with all of the game's weapons being targeted and deployed via the touchscreen controlled reticule. It feels almost a little like Kid Icarus Uprising with the way the console is held and used, although the player is only given 2 weapons over the course of the game, a targeted missile attack and a direct laser beam that can be toggled with the touchscreen. I often found myself using the missiles almost exclusively, as the game's narrow field of view and close over-the-shoulder perspective often meant that even slow-moving enemies could move out of view before they could be destroyed with the laser, and thus deal damage to me where I can't see them. Whereas the missile attack, once locked on, remained locked on until the attack is fired by releasing the touchscreen stylus. The conservation of ammunition is the game's chief mechanic, as both your health and weapons draw from the same pool, so taking repeated hits can leave you stunned temporarily and unable to attack, whilst going all in on the attack leaves you very vulnerable to counterattacks if you aren't careful, meaning there's a lot more thought and effort that goes into managing the cadence of combat than you would first think. Even grunt enemies can pose a threat if you overextend yourself, but proper management of your attacks leading to a chain of kills on enemies does reward the player with additional segments of shield pool to keep the combo going, so getting into a rhythm of devastation is ideally what you need to aim for. This does bring us to the matter of enemies, or rather the lack thereof. There are only about 3 or 4 enemy types found throughout the game. Tanks, turrets, battleships, and submarines, not counting the handful of mini-bosses that you encounter such as the train on level 4. All of these mostly stand to be obstacles to the player in large numbers, as very little varies between them aside from their projectiles' speed and the rate of fire. Barring the battleships, they also tend to die in a single hit, so combined with a somewhat wonky hit detection, they aren't generally an enormous threat. However, if your shields are down from overextending on attacks, they are quite capable of sneaking hits in to chip your main health bar down. The main objective of every level revolves around locating and destroying Dominion structures known as conduit spikes, which are the devices being used to siphon the spiritual energy from Japan, with each acting as a mini-boss that you need to defeat amidst a wave of enemy reinforcements that supplement the spike's own defenses before moving on to a greater spike once all of the level's lesser spikes are destroyed. And this is a multi-stage boss fight, with each level transitioning more from a shoot-'em-up into nearly a bullet hell. Each greater spike putting out a complex and unique pattern of projectiles with a special gimmick to avoid, all of which change as you whittle down their multiple health bars. My only real complaint with these boss fights is that once the final health bar is gone, Shoko deploys a weapon known as the Sacrifice Drive, which only works by quickly drawing circles on the touchscreen, and failing this little event invalidates the entire, sometimes considerably long boss fight. Also, given how fast the game wants you to do this spinning, it does feel like you're going to grind a hole in your screen if you aren't careful, or just have gorilla hands like me, almost like an inverse Mario Party palm. All levels bar the first and last also have secondary, non-compulsory objectives to break up the otherwise monotonous pace of the levels that all require sizable detours, at least by the standards of the game's small map, with the ability to complete every objective quickly being a mark of skills that the game records, although none are particularly troublesome to complete, usually only requiring the player to destroy some out-of-the-way buildings or finding all of the map's hidden enemies. When the level is finished, you are given a score and approval rating from the Japanese public, sort of like a twisted arcade game, with points and approval being given for the speed with which the player completed the level, how many secondary objectives were completed in that time, as well as the percentage of enemies destroyed and how thoroughly they purified Japan, with purification being done by destroying Dominion structures, such as military airports, barracks, and... Oh, okay, that one's not a good look. That looks like a civilian structure? Like an apartment block, or maybe a hospital? It is said that the Dominion's colonizing Japan. They can't all be military assets. There's more there than I feel qualified to unpack, but just note that if you want New Japan to love their mech-fighting teenage president, you need to go scorched earth on the entire map. Moving on to different topics, gameplay overall feels fine enough. It's easy to pick up and play with minimal experience or practice, but provides enough of a skill ceiling to allow players to improve themselves a little as they play. It would get monotonous if the game was any longer than it is, however. To circle back to controls, as mentioned, they feel to me a little bit like Kid Icarus Uprising, mixed in with tank controls of all things. They're fluid enough and certainly play to the almost floaty motion that Kamui displays in its animations, although the acceleration and deceleration of movement can take a little bit of getting used to, since it makes over or undershooting targets fairly easy, and until the end of the game it plays almost no role until the final battle, when it suddenly becomes very important to dodging the kaiju spirit's attacks, when suddenly you need to get very good at it very quickly. It should also be noted that the touch controls are a little precise, with weapon targeting, especially for the laser, being quite hit or miss, to pardon the quasi-pun. Sometimes a hit simply would not register, and a missile would not lock on if you didn't sweep the targeting reticule over an enemy at just the right speed or angle, which left me at times basically scrubbing the touchscreen with the stylus to make some attacks stick, and contributed heavily to the fact that outside of very rare cases, I basically never touched the laser, as I could have the beam directly intersecting an enemy, but not have it count as a hit for some reason. As has been said, the campaign only consists of 4 reasonably short levels, being able to have the entire thing completed in scant more than an hour. However, this runtime is padded out to some extent by offering some alright replay options. The also previously mentioned achievement system does encourage players to replay levels to try and ferret out a couple dozen odd trophies to redeem for more lore tidbits about the world, but the main meat is presented in the game's time attack and challenge modes, which challenge the player to either try and beat a level or even the entire campaign under a certain time constraint. Both are certainly appreciated and make the game feel more full and complete than it would without them, but neither fundamentally alter the initial campaign experience, and even maxing everything out, it won't take most players more than 3 or 4 hours, and even that's being generous with time. Graphics are a mixed bag for Liberation Maiden, partially due to the 3DS's hardware limitations, but also somewhat objectively. The 3D models are all almost strictly functional, portraying just enough detail to get across the concepts they're trying to portray, but it can hardly be called pretty in any sense. Most of the models having flat vertex shading and a poly count close to that of a PS1 game, rather than even a launch 3DS title. Given that the frame rate is rock solid and stutters in a game that is this fast paced would render it almost unplayable, concession was likely made in service to ensuring the 3DS's limited hardware could keep the pace, but it does mean that the game itself is somewhat muddy and samey in every area. Conversely, the little portraits that pop up when Kira and Shoko are talking, as well as the 2 animated cutscenes, are high resolution, and are as lovingly crafted as one could find on the console, which is rather humorous considering how big of a backseat the game's story actually takes. The game's music is, much like the skeleton of a story, very much standard genre fare. A synth-heavy electric rock backing track to try and build hype in the player as they zip around on their mech blasting enemies. It's not bad by any sense of the word, but it isn't memorable either. If I hadn't re-watched my own gameplay footage to make this review, I wouldn't have been able to tell you that there was more than one general gameplay track at all. But it holds to the theme and doesn't detract from the experience, which really is all that can be asked for. The one exception to this is the song played during the final battle with the Guardian Spirit. This song, I think, is where most of the music budget went. Not only is it significantly faster paced and complex, but it's also the only one with any vocals mixed in, lyrics being obligatory for an epic final battle and all. Unlike the other songs, this one is mixed in such a way that you are made aware of its presence throughout the entire stage, and arguably this is actually to its detriment, as there is only one song for the entire multi-stage fight, and it isn't long enough to not loop multiple times over the level's duration, at least with how long it took me to beat the level. So despite being the higher effort offering, I actually found it more annoying than the other less noticeable tracks in the soundtrack, so I will be deducting some marks there. Much like the music, the game's sound effects are present. They're competent but forgettable. They do become somewhat irritating by game's end, the missile's lock beeps especially, as there's no real variance to any of them, but there's just not enough here to talk about to properly comment. Comparatively, and to my surprise, the entire game is voice acted, for the main story at least. Dialogue in general is not extensive, kept to short cutscenes mid-mission, but every interaction between Kira and Shoko is voiced, and none too shabbily given the very general writing that the actors were given. The VAs are unnamed, but breathe a lot of life into their characters whenever they appear. Both even have voice bites for certain actions in the game, such as taking a hit or getting a combo, and nothing is terribly overacted either, which is just all the more impressive. It wouldn't win a Logie, maybe, but it is quite well done for a game of this scope. As a final note, I actually came into this review under the assumption the game was a one and done for the 3DS, a sort of proof of concept for Grasshopper Productions to dip their toes into game development on the platform, and a small gem that was locked to the now defunct 3DS eShop, despite the quite positive reception the game seemed to have received from critics both at the time and more recently. So I was quite pleasantly surprised to discover that the game not only has a standalone mobile port to iOS of all platforms, but also a visual novel sequel on the Nintendo Switch called Liberation Maiden Sin. So it's not quite the piece of lost media I originally thought it was. All being said and done, Liberation Maiden is a worthwhile play experience, if you come into it with managed expectations. It's certainly not a game you will come back to again and again, but if what you're looking for is a solidly executed anime shoot-'em-up to spend a couple of hours on, there are certainly far worse options, and the game has a couple of enjoyable high points to boot. As such, the game gets fairly consistent C's across the board and a matching final grade. From memory, the game was listed on the eShop here in Australia for around $7.50, and I can certainly say it is/was comfortably worth that price, at least to me. The game itself is fun and doesn't outstay its welcome, and those two things were not always guaranteed on eShop titles in that price range. So if you have the game already on your 3DS, feel like hunting down a copy of Guildo 1, or pick up the iOS version, you certainly won't regret the hour or two you put into it. Just don't be surprised when you maybe don't come back for seconds. Anyway, thank you class for staying to the end once again. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and until next time, class dismissed.